to get up that great big hill of hope for a destination. I realized quickly when I knew I should that the world was made up of this brotherhood of man, for whatever that means. And I try, oh my God, do I try? I try all the time in this institution. And I pray, oh my God, do I pray? I pray every single day for revolution into a closer times when I'm lying in bed just to get it all out what's in my head. And I am feeling a little peculiar into a wake in the morning and I step outside and I take a deep breath and I get real high and I scream from the top of my lungs, what's going on? And I say, hey, yeah, yeah, hey, yeah, yeah. I said, hey, oh, what's going on? And I said, hey, yeah, yeah, hey, yeah, yeah. I said, hey, oh, what's going on? And I said,
Well, welcome to another edition of Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. It's going to be a great show tonight. We have a discussion and a debate going on tonight with one of Canada's, I would say, Canada's foremost scholar on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have former Newfoundland Premier, the Honourable Brian Peckford, joining us tonight. For those who aren't aware, Brian is the last surviving premier back from that time in 1982, when all our premiers and our federal government repatriated the Constitution. It was quite a process. Tonight, we know that many people are questioning the value of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What we have seen over the last 4.5 years, the Charter, for many people, didn't stand up for its greatest test during COVID. So welcome for everyone to join us for tonight's show with the Honourable Brian Peckford.
March of 2020, Canadians woke up and realized that this great charter of rights and freedoms that were sold to us as a great means to protect those rights and freedoms meant nothing. And we realized that it was only a worthless piece of paper. It was hailed with great fanfare 38 years earlier as a means to prevent government from intruding into our fundamental freedoms. It even went so far as to recognize that Canada was a nation founded on the supremacy of God back in 1982. But in March of 2020, we found out that this great shield, this great document that was going to protect us from an abusive government, abusive institutions, and overreach by these very same institutions and government, was no longer our defense. Our courts upheld this government overreach and abuse of our fundamental freedoms, as they agreed with the government that we could be locked down, we could be isolated, we could be confined, that our fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly, worship, expression, speech, and mobility were no longer fundamental. Our courts protected the government narrative rather than protecting our rights and freedoms. This week in Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual, I'm pleased to have former Newfoundland Premier Brian Peckford join with us. Many of you will know that Brian was a very outspoken and vocal defender of freedom during that dark era of COVID when our Charter of Rights and Freedoms was dismissed. I think we can all say we realize now that any and every law is only as good as the integrity of the people who are employed to enforce and uphold the law. But this week, former Premier Peckford, myself, and Lee Stewie will be doing a deep dive into what went wrong with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and how can we make it a shield to protect our rights and freedoms once again. Stay tuned for a lovely, wonderful, and I think very informative episode as we dig into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada.
Well, joining me tonight as well, I'd like to introduce Lee Stewie. Will be joining us, and she'll be keeping these two newfies who want to chatter about the Charter in line a little bit and pose a few questions and make sure the discussion stays on track. Thanks for joining us, Lee.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Excited to do episode 6 with Brian Peckford. I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about the Charter. But before we get into it, I'm going to just do a bit of housekeeping. If you're just joining us for the first episode here today, the last portion of the stream is going to be Randy and Brian answering your questions that were submitted through Randy's website at randyhillier.com/ask-a-question. But if you didn't get a chance to do that prior to the stream, you can send in a super chat on YouTube and we will get to those as well at the last portion of the stream. If you're watching this on the replay or you're using another platform other than YouTube, you can also donate at Randy's website, nomorlockdowns.com/donate. And also there's a Twitter space after the stream at 9:30 on the No More Lockdowns account. So we'll see you there as well. And I think that's about it. We can get ahead with getting Brian on, and very exciting stream. I'm super excited.
Well, thank you, Lee. And yes, following this live stream, we'll be jumping over onto the No More Lockdowns Twitter space and continuing on with your questions and comments. So with that, let's introduce Brian Peckford to the studio. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us, Brian.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleased to be here.
So let me just say, I want to preface a little bit with for tonight's 42 years ago, and that's when the Charter came into effect, but it had taken quite a period of time and discussions before we got to that signing date in 1982. But I would like to, and we saw what happened during COVID. We all did. But in 1982, I think one of the big questions and themes over the night, Brian, that I want to explore as well is in 1982, Canada was a fairly homogenous country. And it was written at a time when Canada was just that. And everybody knew what reasonable meant. Back in 1982, we didn't think we would ever have the day when public nudity going down the streets masquerading as a pride parade would be reasonable. So I think one of the big things is what's changed more our interpretation of the charter or the culture that is interpreting it. So with that, maybe we'll start off there, Brian. What's your thoughts between the culture of Canada today as it was in 1982, and how big of an impact has that had on the way the charter is being utilized or not utilized?
Well, first of all, we can't talk about just the charter, because the charter was only one part of the larger Patriation agreement that was negotiated in 1981-82. Many people think we were just negotiating the charter, and that would be a very erroneous perception. There are 60 segments to the Constitution Act 1982. 38 of them deal with the charter. The others deal with other matters which were negotiated at the same time. So one of the problems a lot of Canadians have is that they have that misconception that we were just negotiating a charter. If we were, it's highly likely it would be a lot different than it is today, because we wouldn't have had to bargain other parts of the Patriation Act as we did in 1981-82. For example, the whole question of Indigenous rights, the whole question of equalization, the whole question of minority language rights, the whole question of non-renewable resources, the whole question of the amending formula, all were components with the charter. Some days and some weeks, they were more important than the charter. So the charter got mixed in with a bunch of other important issues, and it was negotiated then as part of this larger package. And so there was ebb and flow and negotiations going on where various parts of the charter were being bargained and talked about in the same context as equalization or minority language rights or other things. And so that is the reason why some people, I think, get the thing wrong, in the sense that it was not just the charter. And so it made it far, far more difficult for people like me and others who were involved in negotiating at the time. And it happened over 17 months and involved hundreds of people. It never just involved the First Minister. For example, one of the great erroneous things that is humorous to me is that, for example, anytime you put up a picture of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, another great mythology going around, there's only one signature on it.
Yeah.
And that signature is the Prime Minister's. That's wrong. That's constitutionally incorrect. But you'll find it because that's the only one that's available, because the federal government puts it out. But the Prime Minister Trudeau's signature on that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, his charter and his Patriation Act lost in the Supreme Court of Canada in 1981, and he had to come back to the table and negotiate. And that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that Patriation Agreement of 60 items, was negotiated by 10 premiers and the Prime Minister. And so to have a legitimate picture framed of the Patriation Agreement, or just the charter, some people just want to frame the charter, then you must have the names of all those who helped negotiate it on it. The only person's name who wouldn't be on it, because they didn't agree with it, was Quebec. And so Laurent Lévesque's name wouldn't be there, but all the other first ministers who were around at the time should have their names on it. So a legitimate charter to show what it's all about, because it was a national document. It wasn't a federal document. You see, by having just the Prime Minister's name on it, you've got a federal document. Well, that's the same as the Bill of Rights back in 1960 when Diefenbaker brought in the Bill of Rights. That was a federal act. The big issue and the big point about the Charter and the Patriation Agreement, it was a national document. That is, it was the Constitution of the country.
So Brian, did each of the premiers sign that Constitution? Okay, so the
Patriation Act, yeah.
Okay, so that's a question that many people have. because everybody was glued to their TV sets, or who saw the Queen and Pierre Trudeau signing it on that day, but they did not.
Yeah, that was the act going through Parliament, for the Parliament of Canada at the time, after we had signed the Patriation Agreement. But that signing on Parliament Hill that day would not have been possible without the signatures of a majority of the premiers on the Patriation Act, which was the foundation document. The legislation that you see signed, right, is the culmination, or the legislation that culminated from the Patriation Agreement.
So are you satisfied with the charter that you signed in 1982? And are you satisfied as a former premier and as a Canadian? And if not, what factors have contributed to the diminishing value of the charter?
Now, there's built into that question, is the problem is not so much with the charter as how it has been interpreted by the courts and the governments since. It got off to a rather rocky start right after it was negotiated, because within a couple of days, there were people around who were trying to undermine it, to the point where they even erroneously tried to diminish the role that yours truly played and the Newfoundland delegation played in bringing the Patriation Agreement together. Was a proposal by the Newfoundland delegation, led by me, that actually broke the impasse on November 3rd, 4th, and 5th in Ottawa, from which came the Patriation Agreement at that last day on the 5th. And right from day one, there was a disagreement over that. And then the first decisions out of the courts based upon the Constitution Act 1982 were wrong right from the start, and have been ever since, because the first decisions that were made by the court were ignoring the opening words of the Charter, whereas this country is founded on the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, at the end, colon, a punctuation mark, colon, which was deliberate on behalf of all the first ministers, which meant everything that comes after is based upon these two principles.
Right.
And right from day one, the courts ignored that. So the charter and the Patriation Agreement got off to a bad start, especially the charter part of it, because the opening words are unique to the charter. And but you did it. What happened, I think, and when you talk about the culture has changed and so on, unfortunately in Canada, unlike the United States, we very early on through our law schools and through teaching lawyers developed the theory of the living tree, which was a constitution changes according to the mores and values of the society as it grows. That's not how many people in the United States view it, nor is it how I view it. That's the key reason why the amending formula was so important. 1927 was the first time we tried to patriate the Constitution. And 10 times thereafter, from 1927 to 1981, the government of Canada tried to do it, and it always got stopped because of the amending formula. We couldn't bring the Constitution home if we didn't have a way to change it in Canada. And so that amending formula is very important. And so we did get an amending formula. That's why the thing was patriated. We got an amending formula. And it's through the amending formula that we should be looking for change, not through judges from the court interpreting what they see as the new values in a society. That's why the Constitution is so permanent and it's so difficult to change, because without it being permanent and difficult to change, you would have these varying things which we see now happening. And so a lot of our problem is with how leadership in the country took over the charter and the whole thing and reinterpreted it to suit themselves. And that's what's really happened, because right from day one, the opening words of the charter were ignored. This would never happen in the United States. This would never happen in the United States. And that's the difference between, and of course, it took us from 1867 to 1982 to get a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights. In the United States, it was 14 years after the country was formed, they had a Bill of Rights.
So that 2 points
Their
there.
culture of rights and freedoms is far more entrenched into their system or into their culture than it is in Canada. Ours is a more flippant one, where many Canadians almost view the Charter as like another piece of legislation, when it's far more sacred, it's far more permanent, it's far more a part of who we are than is given credit for here in Canada. And that comes out of our different evolutions as societies. They had a revolution, we didn't. They started from scratch. We went along with and were part of the British system of common law, unwritten common law, which therefore helped develop a different type of society and a different way of viewing constitutions than in the United States of America.
So, Brian, there's two things that come out of that. One is we know that the living tree doctrine was present back in the 80s. It may not have been as entrenched as it is today. But you also said that there were people seeking to undermine it right from the get-go. Is that other political players in provinces?
It was a lot to do with the journalists and lawyers and so on at the time. Books were written soon after the Constitution Act 82 was passed, describing how this whole thing happened, completely erroneous and wrong, and it's still in the on the internet today. If you go into I think it's the encyclopedia, the Canadian Encyclopedia, you will find a false narrative as to how all this unfolded, and you'll also find it in the CBC documents that were developed afterwards on the history of Canada and the history of the thing. So, and unfortunately, when Blakeney, Premier Blakeney was still alive, and Premier Law, we attended a number of early annual meetings celebrating the anniversary of the Charter, where we pointed out to them at the time at the University of Montreal, at the Constitutional Center in University of Alberta, on various other programs, and in writing letters that we wrote to the national newspapers, pointing out the erroneous way that people had of describing how the thing came together. But then it got even more serious over time, because we had the courts and the governments making decisions that ignored the opening words of the Charter, and then began to interpret various policy areas that were completely at odds with the intention and the wording as we understood it at the time of the Charter and of the Constitution generally.
So many people are confused about the amending formula. What was your view back then and now of the amending formula?
Well, amending formula is there written down for everybody to see. And the amending formula means that general provisions of the Act or of the Constitution Act can be changed by 7 provinces representing at least 50% of the population from the previous census. And then there's a group of subjects that would take unanimity. So there's 2 parts to the amending formula. One is 70% and 7 provinces and 70% of the population, 50% of the population, and the other is unanimity, where you need to have all the governments on side. So that's the amending formula. But the problem has been the leadership of the country. The country has devolved in such a way where the provinces have relinquished a lot of their sovereignty that they have under the Constitution. For example, the National Health Act is a really good example. Health is provincial, but right now the federal government's input into health and influence in health policy is just as great or greater than the provinces, and especially in those provinces which are have-not provinces. They depend a lot upon the money they get from the federal government, and it demeans the sovereignty and reduces the sovereignty that those provinces therefore exercise. And that's why it's so difficult now to change the constitution, even 7 provinces and 50% of the population, because so many of the provinces are have-provinces, have-not provinces, that the federal government can divide and conquer, because through the back door they can always threaten the smaller, weaker provinces, the less well-off provinces, that you have a whole bunch at stake here if in fact you start to exercise your sovereignty as it is outlined in the BNA Act and as it is outlined in the 1982 Constitution. So that's what really changed. When you posed the early question, when we came on the air first, that's what's really changed, is that because values and stuff are always going to change, and the only way you can handle that is through a constitution, because otherwise you end up in almost like in mob rule. People are going all over the place, and so you need to have a way in which you can change the constitution, but you need to have leadership in order to do it. Luckily, in 1981-82, there was the leadership available to put aside some of the provincial interests for the national interest. I did it in my case, for example, where we were holding out to rearrange the powers on the fishery, because that was our largest industry at the time, still is a big industry in Newfoundland, and we wanted to have more say over it. We didn't need to necessarily put in the Constitution constitutional provisions, but a provision whereby the province must be consulted on various parts of fisheries policy that were still in Ottawa. And I relinquished that for the sake of getting a patriation agreement, for example. And other provinces did likewise on various issues that they had, that they wanted to see change in. So we don't have that today so much. We don't.
So, Brian,
leaders demonstrating a national interest.
I think this is an important element in here that a lot of people don't realize within the Constitution, and it's that the division of powers. And you brought up the Canada Health Act, and to me, that is probably one of the most outrageous examples of the federal government usurping the sovereignty of the provinces. And we've seen this where the federal government is now willing to bribe, and some of the provinces don't take much to bribe either, Brian. Let me, but they're willing to.
Even Alberta is still being bribed by the federal government.
Yeah.
By the way, just before you go on, just let me say this because before so we don't lose it, and you can come back to it again, and then I'll stop and let you finish your point. But listen, this is a very, very key point, because that's what diminishes Alberta and Saskatchewan and those people who are arguing on energy policy and environmental policy. This is their weak point, because the judges and the courts, when it gets to the courts, some of these issues that Alberta is now arguing, or Saskatchewan is arguing, and other provinces too. But if the judges realize that, oh, that's funny, for Alberta, they're arguing away on the energy side, that there's oil and gas is owned by the provinces, yet on the health side and on the social services side, on the higher education side, on the infrastructure side, they're ceding to the federal government. And so that makes the argument that Alberta is now making weaker. Where? Not next door in the pub, but where it really counts, amongst the judges and the judiciary, and gives the federal government unnecessary and really unconstitutional leverage over the courts, because the courts are starting to say in their decisions, right, well, the federal government's got to have a role here, and because you've done this now for so long, it becomes a precedent.
Yeah. That's the very point I was getting to. Like, we did it with the Canada Health Act, and that was the most outrageous one. And I think at the time, I may be off by a few dollars, but the federal government used, I think it was $6 billion at the time to buy the jurisdiction of health from all the provinces. Well, except they still left the responsibility with the provinces to deliver it, but that Canada Health Act came with about $6 billion federally annually at the time, and we've seen this, and then of course I would say that has very much grown and grown. I can see that maybe some of the lesser prosperous provinces would be willing to do that, but it's still to their own long-term detriment, in my view. And then we saw what.
But Andrew, but Randy, you got to understand that the Ontario and Quebec are doing it to the same degree as the poorer provinces, and that makes it even worse in trying to argue something before the courts later.
I agree 100%. But we also see what happens there, like what happened with COVID. Now, the Public Health Agency of Canada is the dominant and superior institution in the country, even though public health and health are provincial jurisdictions.
You're dead right.
So the divisions of power, I think, is really, really important for people to understand that their provinces are abdicating their responsibilities generally in exchange for a few dollars.
No question. And what happened is that when the National Health Act came in, especially, it then opened the door for other areas to also be breached. For example, social services was called established program financing at the time. There was the National Health Transfer, called the Health Transfer, and there was what was called established program financing, which was another fancy phrase for social services and in some parts of education. Well, that's in balloon now. And then we got into the DRE programs, not only in the have-not provinces, by the way, in Northern Ontario and in Quebec, and then out west, the Western Diversification Program, were all part of this infrastructure thing, almost totally provincial.
Yeah. No, I agree. Even Ontario's been party to that.
They have their own thing up north, yeah.
And even in southern Ontario.
And now in southern Ontario too, exactly.
So for people who don't realize that the DRE program, what Brian just referred to, is the regional economic expansion. And these were supposed to be government grants to less developed, more impoverished or less prosperous areas of the country. And the federal government would bring in bucket loads of dough, bucket loads of dough.
When it started first, I was around then. I was a minister at the time. When it started first, it was a negotiation between the provinces and the federal government. And there was a cost-sharing kind of arrangement, and deals were made where the jurisdiction was still respected, the province was still in control, and they had this amount of money, some of it federal, some provincial, into a provincial sovereignty area. But very soon after it got started, suddenly you had the federal government and the MPs talking to a municipality, which was a completely provincial beast under the Constitution. And suddenly you saw MPs and a federal minister announcing a municipal project somewhere in the province with hardly any, if none, involvement of the province. And then we had to stand up and try to stop that, and we never did totally succeed, because they went through the door of wharves and ports, which were federal, and gradually moved in through there to do things that were municipal. So it became very insidious and all-encompassing. And now, of course, it's all over Canada, and most of the provincial areas of jurisdiction are now being threatened, even those in the energy and of course, environment being part federal and part provincial is a real easy pick for the federal government.
Before we go off to the next part, I do want to say this. I would say that if the provinces and if Canadians don't wake up soon on this division of powers, they're going to wake up one day and realize that we no longer have a confederation.
Exactly.
We're close to that point right now, where our provinces have become, in many aspects, not much more than a lapdog and a junior lapdog fighting over a federal bone. And it's not going to be a confederation. It'll be a highly centralized and bureaucratically planned nation if we don't. And so I would say one other thing before we move on, and that is that many people are convinced, or sort of convinced, that this is some big, to amend the Constitution is just too big of a job for mere mortals, Brian. Like this is just, it can't be done. But provinces have amended the Constitution on a multitude of occasions since 1982 without much difficulty. Well, with no difficulty at all. It's just passing a piece of legislation and requesting the government to incorporate it into our Constitution, like New Brunswick did with the bilingualism, Newfoundland did with the denominational schools.
Yeah, but it has to be unique to that province, so that therefore it's just a deal between one province and the federal government to do the national health and the education and the social services. It would take the amending formula.
Yeah, but it is, and I think people need to realize that there are multiple amending formulas. It's not just one.
Well, no, that's not correct. That's not correct. There's only one amending formula, but there are areas in the Constitution which are unique to one province in the federal government, where therefore you're not affecting the other provinces, and you can do it. But like in education and health and all that, where all the provinces are involved and where the division of powers clearly says where it is, you do need the 7 out of 10, 50% of the population.
I agree with that. And maybe the language was not as precise, but a province can amend its constitution. Yeah, it's on jurisdiction that is provincial jurisdiction. The province can incorporate laws into the federal constitution. No,
it's not a federal constitution. It's a national constitution, and you can only incorporate laws that are unique to that province, but also then takes the federal government to change it, because you have to put it into the constitution. But it has to be, it's individual. It's not collective. It's only one province. Right. That province has to have a unique circumstance, which is not present anywhere else.
As I was explaining with New Brunswick, their change only applied to New Brunswick. They're the only bilingual province recognized in the Constitution Act.
Exactly. So to come back to your point, which is very valid, is that we are gradually moving towards a more unitary state, because the main levers of power which are available within the Confederation are ones that take the amending formula. And unless the provinces become leaders again and come together and force amending formula solutions rather than backdoor solutions, then the less likely we're going to continue to be a federal state. It's only a federal state in name.
During COVID, you became a high-profile opponent of the actions of all governments. What compelled you to reemerge on the Canadian political stage, and what actions were you involved in?
Okay, well, I got involved because I suddenly realized that what the governments were doing provincially and federally, both, a lot of the mandates and lockdowns were provincial, and then others were federal, and so this flew in the face of what we had negotiated in 1981-82. This was completely different from what the whole business of Section 1 of the Constitution. Well, first of all, the opening words. Suddenly they were now we were getting down to real. You see, in the general course of events from 82 on, there were only a few of us who were writing letters to the paper and making comments. Some got carried, a lot never, that the federal government was overstepping its hand. And they got away with it. And they were encouraged to continue to do that because a lot of the lawyers going to law school were learning this living tree doctrine at the same time. And so the dominant conversation, my conversation got lost, as others who were supporting what I was saying. And so gradually, this is what happened. But when COVID hit, because it was so universal, it was so national, and involved, crucially, people's religious rights, right? People's right to speak, people's right to associate, right on the ground, right where I live, right here in Parksville, Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I wasn't allowed to go into this store. I wasn't allowed to go into this shop. It was real. It was bread and butter stuff. Suddenly, right, it came home. And when I saw that happen on such a scale, and then doctors losing, one of my first big actions was when Dr. Charles Hoff in Lytton, BC, was suddenly losing his job because he asked a few questions of the regional health authority about COVID and the vaccines, and how he had patients who were getting sick right after taking the vaccines. And his patients were mainly First Nations patients, and they were the first ones to get a lot of the early COVID shots. And so I called him and found out from him that it was true what the alternate press was carrying. He was being challenged and being told that he had to keep his mouth shut if he wanted to keep his license. He's still fighting that, by the way, today in the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC, believe it or not. So that's when I got involved first. And then I started talking to other individuals because I had my own blog and I was talking to a lot of people, and people were contacting me. And so that's how I got involved. And then I started to go back through my own notes of the time on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the importance of the opening words of the Charter of Section 1. For example, Section 1, my understanding at the time, and the other First Ministers, was that this could only be initiated in a situation of war, or the state existence was in jeopardy, and that's given credence. If you look at Section 4, where the Parliament could be suspended, but only in the state of war, or a state where the state existence was in jeopardy. So we just thought at the time, tragically, that this was self-evident, as was, of course, that the God that we talked about was a Judeo-Christian God, which is now being interpreted by the judges can be anybody's God. It's not a Judeo-Christian. And this, of course, this flies in the face of common sense, because everybody at the table was a Christian.
Yeah.
We know no other God, only the Christian God. So what other God was it? If we knew no other, it had to be a Christian God. But now that's getting mangled, right? And now it's not even being ignored completely. And so we've become a completely secular state as a result of ignoring that first one. So that's how I got involved.
Oh, that's we've seen that. You mentioned Dr. Charles Hoff, and he was one of the early ones. And again, where we've seen none of these protections have helped any of the professionals, any of the doctors in their fight with their CPA here in Ontario, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, but similar bodies everywhere.
But look at Brian Bridle is a really good example, even better in some ways, than Jordan Peterson's one in Ontario again. Mr. Bridle today, Dr. Bridle at the University of Guelph, he's still not allowed to go in his lab. Yeah.
But you mentioned that it was the thinking behind that at the time was the existence of the state was in jeopardy. That's where that would kick in.
And Randy, I got to interject again because this is very important. If you look at the jurisprudence anywhere in the democratic world and here in Canada, as it relates to how you interpret constitutions, they always talk of intent. And, and because you can't write every single word of every single circumstance into a constitution. That's not the nature of a constitution. You can do more so in legislation, but you're talking about principles and what the principles stand for and what was the intent of the principles when they were written. But strangely enough, that's not done as it relates to the COVID circumstance and how the governments were able to skate past Section 1.
You don't see any of that reference or any of that threshold, Brian,
exactly
within any of the consequential tests that the courts have now developed. They are, it's really sort of bizarre to me how some of these tests have been developed that it flies in the face of the Constitution itself.
Yeah, and it's common sense. And by the way, in certain instances, the Manitoba decision, the early Manitoba decision on right to the appeal court of Manitoba, the decision there where they actually ignored the expert scientific advice and said so. We're just going to believe what the government says and forget about what Jay Bhattacharya says or Peter McCullough says or other leading experts who were providing data and scientific information on the other side of the argument. They actually came right out and said that. Yep. In the same way as they ignored the opening words to the charter. So it's become a field day for judges and governments to select and choose when it is they're going to use something in the Constitution and when they're not. We're in a constitutional crisis, and Canada still doesn't realize it.
Right.
Are you surprised and or disappointed that you're the only former premier, and I'll say as Randy as well, I'll include Randy, who challenged the COVID restrictions on a constitutional grounds?
I'm very surprised at, there are still people alive, and I will not name them. There are still people alive who were my age. I'm going on 83, who are my age, but I was one of the younger ones, one of the younger premiers at the time. So, that's why I guess I'm still around, because I was younger than the other people, other first ministers. But I am very surprised and disappointed by a group of other people, because like I said to you at the beginning, there were hundreds involved in this. The delegations of all the provinces, we had experts. We had our own experts. We just didn't rely upon federal government stuff, because we were negotiating to try to make sure it stayed a confederation and that the province's powers were still protected in any charter or any new amendment to the Constitution. So we were very much our own players in this, and we sought advice far and wide. Newfoundland did too. And so I'm very surprised that some of those people, and I met some of them in those conferences I told you about that I had back like 10 or more than 10 years ago now, when I went to the University of Alberta to speak, when I went to the University of Montreal to speak on the anniversary of the Charter, anniversary of the Patriation Agreement, anniversary of the Constitution Act of 1982. And some of them quietly, over a dinner or whatever, would come and sit next to me, some from Quebec, by the way, as well, and tell me that they supported what I had just said in the forum, in the public forum, but couldn't say anything about it otherwise. All right. And so I'm very, very surprised, because there's still some ministers around who were ministers in various of the provincial governments who later became judges, others didn't, but are still alive, who have remained so quiet, number one. Number two, I'm also very surprised at the number of political scientists and actual constitutional scholars who have remained silent on this. It's absolutely amazing to me. And I wake up every day now still using the word unbelievable. I just don't believe what I'm hearing. I don't believe what I'm seeing. And I don't believe the silence that's become so pervasive throughout the land amongst people who know what I'm saying is correct, who understand, who were there, who understand what we were talking about at the time. And we had, all the provinces had reams of scholars who said that no court would ever go to the extent that the courts have now gone. We were told, we were advised by the best scholars around in and outside of Canada, those in other parts of the British Commonwealth, Australia, whatever, England itself, about this. By the way, what is not well known, I was in London when the federal government tried to patriate the Constitution unilaterally and lost. I mentioned it earlier, and then Trudeau lost and had to come back to the table. That was September 1981 that he lost. But before that, when the federal government passed their own bill through the House of Commons, it was passed through the House of Commons. The majority in the House of Commons supported Trudeau unilaterally going and getting his own charter and his own patriation agreement from London. We went to London, and I was one of the ones who went. I met with people of the House of Lords. I was on BBC television debating what I'm debating now. And to a person, all of the scholars in London at the time, who were constitutional experts on this, much more so than I was, saying, right, that no, and when Trudeau did what he did, they said he'll never get through here. That's why he had to. What Trudeau then did, by the way, the provinces took him to court, and after he passed his unilateral thing, but then he realized that he was in trouble in London, and he was going to be in trouble in the appeal courts, because we took the Trudeau to court in Newfoundland, Quebec, and Manitoba, I think. And the appeal courts were, you could tell from the hearings that a lot of the appeal judges had little time for the kind of Canada that Trudeau was pursuing, that he could, as one government. And by the way, if you look at that decision, anybody who's really interested in the Constitution, I would really recommend them go to that September the 28th, I think it is, 1981 Supreme Court of Canada reference decision, where the court, Trudeau's best friends, some of his best friends, ruled against him, because everywhere from 1867 until 1981, when there was a change happening which involved the provinces, the federal government consulted and got the approval of a majority of the provinces first. Everyone. And that's all listed in that Supreme Court of Canada decision, which was a great day for the Federation. That was the last great day for the Canadian Confederation, was in September 1981, because the court ruled, yes, this is a federation. The federal government does not have the power to unilaterally change things which are confederal in nature and involve the provinces.
So, but one of the other things, Brian, I think you're the only former premier who has spoken out against COVID as well, right? Is that, am I missing anybody there that, has anybody else come out?
No, I don't think so.
No,
I think you're right there. No, and the former premiers in Newfoundland who came after me, a lot of them still alive, 4 or 5 of them, have not supported. As a matter of fact, the governor of Newfoundland, when I sent them a letter, I sent a letter to all the premiers saying, you have a power to make a reference directly to your highest court to see what you're doing is constitutional or not. Okay, I sent to all the premiers, and my own province, of which I was premier, threatened to take me to court.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
In the letter back to me.
Yeah.
They never did. I told them, I said, I can't wait for the day to see you in court. But that's the other problem we got here, Randy. And it makes me cry, because no court will hear what I'm now saying.
Yeah.
There are lawyers in Canada who put my name forward as part of a charter argument.
Yep.
Okay, for their client. And my name went forward, and the judges turned it down. In my own court case, because I took the federal government to court on the travel ban with other Canadians, but my name was the first one. and the one that was used in quoting the case. My name was always used. And my lawyers said to the federal government, when are you going to call Mr. Peckford? Because your submissions that you're putting in here in discovery, you're immediately saying that Peckford is wrong. So we want, when are you going to call our star candidate to come forward? Because the way the system worked, they had to call me. And the federal government said to Keith Wilson, my lead lawyer at the time, we have no intention of calling Mr. Peckford.
Right.
When the Rule Law Commission got established, my name was put forward because I attended the convoy down in Ottawa, right? I met with the board of the Truckers Convoy. I met with Tamara and Chris Barber and the rest of them. My lawyer became their lawyer. They had to get approval from me to use Keith Wilson as their lawyer. So I was involved in all those talks. I was the one who helped get the Truckers Convoy to negotiate with the city of Ottawa. I was the one who was the catalyst who made that happen through people that I knew who knew the mayor of Ottawa. And that's how it happened. So I was intricately involved. Not only was I the only signature still alive, right? Signatory of the Constitution, but I was intimately involved in all this. And my name went forward and the commission turned down hearing me.
Well, Brian, that's interesting because I know my name was put forward as well, and they did not want to hear from me. I know Maxime Bernier, his name was put forward. I know Derek Sloan's name was put forward. None of the, at that time I was still in an elected office, but no elected or former elected members were permitted to speak at the commission. And not only that, Brian, none of the doctors who were significantly involved, like Dr. Roger Hodgkinson from Alberta,
right.
Dr. Paul Alexander from
Dr. Paul Alexander, or Eric Payne, or Derek Bridle, or any of them, Byron Bridle.
Not a single one of them were permitted to provide testimony at the Public Orders Emergency Commission. So,
well, we got to call it as it is, see, Randy. We got to call it as it is. That whole Rule Law Commission itself was unconstitutional because they never demonstrably justified why they did what they did. Right? Why the federal government did what they did. They didn't justify anything. And here was. By the way, this Emergencies Act was brought in by the Conservatives years ago when they changed the War Measures Act. Here was a government examining itself. The conflict of interest was blatant. Yeah. This was a conflict of interest, complete conflict of interest. And therefore, Canadians should have not allowed this to happen. I mean, this was an awful thing to happen. So our system has become so corrupted by Canadians allowing these things to happen, which are unconstitutional, which are completely against any conflict of interest rule anywhere in the country, that they shouldn't have been allowed to go ahead.
Yeah. No,
but what we did was we went along with it. Yeah. And I was up there on my blog saying this is an unconstitutional thing. The preamble to the Emergencies Act said you have to meet the requirements of the Charter in order for this to proceed. And it never met the requirements of the Charter, but yet proceeded.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, though, that we need to get into is, like, and this is just the way I see it, Brian. I'd like to hear you. I think the wording in the Constitution Act of 1982 is very effective for the people of Canada in 1982 and for and for the intellectual, the legal, the academic, and the moral fabric of our country in 1982. That's different now.
No, I disagree with you. I fundamentally disagree with you because you'll always be changing every 2 or 3 years. There are fundamental principles. What's happened is that our elite are deliberately sabotaging our Constitution. And that's what we got to get at. If you start trying to see that you're going to change this word because in the 1980s was this, 1990s was another thing, then in 2010 is something else, in 2020, you will not have a constitution at all. So what we got to do is get back to the fundamentals and ensure what it is that we're talking about as our bundle of principles are adhered to by the governments and the courts. And in that case, it will take a brand new way of operating government.
Okay, that's one. But at the moment, we know what we're dealing with.
No,
so,
but the point of it all is they're actually ignoring some of the words. So they ignore this part and then use this part. So it makes no difference what the words are. If the words are clear, like, for example, demonstrably justify in a free and democratic society, you're not going to get words that much better than that by another group of people who are amending the Constitution as it relates to if, in fact, there is a circumstance whereby rights can be suspended for a brief period of time. As long as you've got, and by the way, Alberta wouldn't do what I just said now in their Bill of Rights.
well,
Alberta just refused to do what that'll give you an idea. And this is Alberta. So if we kept it done in Alberta, no other province is going to even come close to it. So Alberta would not put in Judeo-Christian God. Just in the last weekend, I'm right involved in it right now. Right involved in it. I wrote the Premier, wrote the Minister. I'm involved with a whole bunch of lawyers and groups of people in Alberta who are on my side. Okay, and the Alberta government, one of the most freedom-loving governments allegedly in the country, and they're still going to use the words in Section 1 that we now know the courts are misinterpreting, and they're still going to use demonstrably justify and free and democratic society, which are ones that we know the courts can have a field day with. So that's where you are when you get into words. Unless you agree on a bundle of principles and get a group of people who understand that, then there's the chances of a true parliamentary democracy are very remote indeed.
Listen, I agree. But there is ways to fix it. There's nothing created by man that can't be fixed by man. So we have, but we know that the judges are doing these things. I do think there could be things that could be strengthened in the Constitution, like one very simple thing. I think this idea of allowing the federal government to bribe provinces.
You're never going to get that change because the 7 out of 10 will never agree to it. That's your problem. We don't have any leadership anymore. So besides which, you can't take one individual thing and say, we can change that, because it never comes with one thing. There were like almost 30 items that we had to negotiate down when we were doing it in 1981-82. There's going to be scores of issues once the Constitution is open, and then you're going to have to do trade-offs. That's what happened in 1981-82. That's what will happen in any new round. So it is incorrect. It is not possible to talk about here why we can change A in the Constitution. No, we can't, because A comes with a B, B comes with a C, C comes with a D, and it's only done in a kind of package kind of circumstance.
Yep.
Would you agree that the charter could be strengthened by removing the reasonable limitations?
No, because you can't open it. You're playing with words here.
But there is an amending form.
Every time I get on these programs, it's the same old story. If we change that, but you can't. That's the problem. And you've got to face reality. We're in a crisis, and this business of what you just said is unworkable, because that can never happen. You're talking, that's a dream world that doesn't exist. And my proof now, in the last week, is Alberta.
Yeah. So, but like I was around in 1981 and 1982, and I was watching carefully the political scene, for lack of a better word, Brian. and there was no constitutional crisis in 1980. Like the country, yeah, was functioning, and some might say it was functioning much better then as well. But there was a desire to have a constitution made in
There
Canada.
were no, Randy. At that time, we were inundated by different interest groups from Vancouver Island to Newfoundland. Every morning, we had either petitions or letters or whatever, either on the whole question of the First Nations rights, right? Because they weren't in the Constitution, or on equalization, or on what should or should not be in the amending formula, on non-renewable resources, which got strengthened through that process of 1981, 82. So there were a lot of things at play, and we knew, and this is where leadership comes in, we knew that it was necessary. The country was going to go into a very difficult situation if we did not make certain changes. The National Energy Program was there, hovering there in the background. Trudeau's promise to a renewed confederation to Levesque in the referendum that had just passed, right? And so on it went, all throughout the nation. And the First Nations people were agitating. So were the women's interest groups. And so on it went. And there was a lot of pressure on us. We realized that we had an opportunity that after 1927, 10 times, we couldn't get an amending formula, and we had to stay at it until we got it. And it would almost fail. It was right down to the last few hours. It was 12 o'clock at night on the 4th, when I was in the Saskatchewan suite making a presentation, which then I presented to the gang of 8 premiers the next morning, which they agreed I would present to all the first ministers later that day, which I did, which became the Constitution Act of 1982.
So,
but we don't have that here now in Canada anymore.
Well, let me phrase it this way, Brian, and get your comments. Recognizing that there was all those pressures, and the treaty rights, the Aboriginal rights, the horrific problems that happened with the National Energy Program with Trudeau, all those things combined. If that was enough of an motivation to create the leadership for a repatriation of the Constitution, I would say to you that there has been no bigger attack on the Canadian people, the Canadian freedoms, the Canadian way of life, and our governance than in the last 4.5 years.
Yes, but all the governments are getting re-elected who went along with all of those unconstitutional violations. And even if the Conservatives get elected, they went along with it. They were nowhere to be found on Parliament Hill when I was there with the truckers' convoy. They're not willing to make the changes that are necessary. So my problem is that, yes, we've changed all right. We're no longer interested in the Confederation that we thought everybody was going to be willing to support.
So let me get this, maybe if I'll phrase it this way. In 1980, in that period leading up to 1982, the pressure was on the government to make the reformations. It wasn't pressure necessarily by the people on government. There was institutional pressures on the government, or government to government pressures, rather than that's what I recall at the time, Brian. It wasn't.
Yeah, but you weren't there. See, this is the problem. You weren't. You were there.
That's why we have you here.
But you weren't in the mix that we were. We had citizens organizations everywhere in Canada coming at us big time, and so were the media as well. That you can't fail this time. You must get something done here. And I think the biggest thing that happened was that the provinces took the federal government to court when they tried to unilaterally do something that reestablished a confederal kind of system, which since has faded away.
Well, I think that's a good point. And maybe You know, Brian, you've just said to everyone listening and everyone who will listen that the citizens' pressures force leadership to do something.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And we've lost our democracy. We don't understand. It's like people who say you can't be a Sunday Christian. A Christian is a person who lives Christianity and lives the life of Christ every day. And that's the same way with democracy. Democracy is something that you have to live every day, and the citizens got to be involved, and they've got to make sure that their MPs meet with them, 4 times a year in between elections, right? And what have you done for me lately, Joe? Have you followed through on what you said during the election campaign? We need vibrant political parties, and right now the political parties are corrupt. They're taking money under the table. They're doing things they shouldn't be doing. The prime minister of our country is a criminal. He's broken the law 5 times. The law, not the ethics code. The law. He's broken the law 5 times, and yet the parties allow him to stay in power. Yeah.
But I think that's another good point that I would, you can't be a Christian just on Sundays. It doesn't work that way. And I would also say, Brian, you can't be an effective and responsible participant and member of a country if you're only going to vote once every 4 years, just like the Christian who only goes on Sundays. It's just not going to work. You need to be far more engaged.
Yeah, I agree. Randy, I issued my Magna Carta back in May 9th, 2022 on the steps of the legislative building in Victoria at a conference on freedom and on the COVID and all the rest of it. And what I said then, and I still stand by today, is that there are a whole bunch of things we can do tomorrow morning if Canadians want to without even changing the Constitution. First of all, we can, as I said at the time, and which is out there in cyberspace, it's in writing. People call me every day looking for copies of it, and I email it off to them. If we just had an honest parliament and honest political parties, let's start there. I've written Polyev, I've written all the leaders in the parliament and said, amend the conflict of interest act so that if an MP breaks the law, he can't serve in parliament. They won't do it.
So, listen, you'll not get any disagreement or argument from me on those.
That's why we're in a crisis, because we can't get the simplest little thing. And I also, at the same time, asked them in their political parties, publish annually your audited financial statement as a party and debate that budget in your annual conventions in your party. And none of them will do that.
No. I think we better get on to see if we can get a couple of questions from the audience, Brian, before we end off for tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, we're reaching the last part of the stream here, and so I'm going to ask from Randy's website, and I'll repeat it again. If you want to submit a question before any of these live streams on Monday night, you can do so at randyhillier.com/ask-a-question. So this one comes from Dr. Green. I don't believe the premiers who originally approved the charter intended for a wholesale transfer of power from elected representatives to the judiciary. Is this the case? Maybe Mr. Peckford can clarify this as a first step towards restoring representative democracy in Canada.
Absolutely. Look, this is the problem, that the courts are no longer entertaining intent like they still are in the United States. And that's one of our problems, that intent has to be a part of any jurisprudence worth its salt, because you can't write everything down to the nth degree. And that's where, and like I say, if you go and read, which I have done, I make it my business every week. I read so many different decisions, and almost throughout all of them, you will find the judges talking about what was meant by that when it was passed. What did the author mean, or what did the creators mean? And here on this particular Constitution and the Charter now, they have deliberately ignored a very important component of determining a constitutional matter. And this is we're deficient. The integrity of the constitutional process has been undermined by the lack of judicial attention to the totality of making a constitutional decision. And this doctor is right. The first ministers never intended for something like COVID, which the science was murky at the time, and then when the science did get clarified and is clarified today, it still hasn't changed. This shows you what a problem we have. I mean, the greatest chance we got now is Robert Kennedy gets confirmed as Secretary of Health in the United States. That's the best chance we got. At least Trump realized, and seems like he's brought in a whole bunch of people who are not necessarily people who were with him at all, or he with them only 6 or 8 months ago. So this reform of how we operate as a democracy. I mean, remember, we're in the minority in the world, right? This is a minority situation. This governance procedure, it's just, it lasted for a while in Greece on 2 or 3 different occasions during Pericles and during Solon. Cicero tried really hard, and you can go through the whole history of the thing. But the majority of people in the world, they don't live in a democracy. So we're always fighting a very difficult situation, because the nature of man as such is that we allow ourselves to become subjected to what we are in Canada today, where we're not really functioning as a democracy. Our citizens aren't, right? Yeah. We're not teaching civics in the schools, right? Students know nothing about how the country works. And so this doctor is right. We need to go back to first principles as to how it is a democracy really operates with the Constitution.
Well, Mr. Thomas Jefferson wrote much about that, this great experiment called democracy requires an informed, educated, and participating citizenry if it is to ever work.
By the way, there's a great division of the law school in San Diego, and its whole division is on originalism. In other words, you interpret the Constitution as written.
Yeah.
You can change it, but you got to go through the amending formula to change it.
Yeah. Well,
and any civilized society, that's what they'll do. They'll use the amending, and then if they want to change the amending formula, you can do that too. But that means being intimately involved in our governance system and in our politics on an ongoing basis. And we need honest, honorable leaders to do that.
Well, listen, Brian and Lee, I think we're coming to the end of our show.
It flew by.
Yeah. Well, listen, Brian, I really do appreciate you taking the time to helping inform people and being on the show and giving us some of more of the insights into the constitutional development.
Let me just say this while I think of it. I have to mention his name. Angus MacLean was the Premier of PEI at the time of the Patriation and the Charter. Now, there was a statesman. Here's a man from the smallest province in Canada, and he stood up for Canada through that whole thing with Trudeau and all the rest of it, that when he tried to unilaterally do it. He had been a Veterans Affairs Minister in Diefenbaker's cabinet, believe it or not. And he was an older man when he became Premier. But here was a really good example of a statesman and a national leader, and he was Premier of the tiny province. There you go, look at that. Thank you very much, PEI. I just had to say that.
Brian, I think when I look back over time and I look at the quality of the premiers of the day, the people like Lougheed, yourself, even Bill Davis here in Ontario, these were some pretty accomplished individuals. And And Rene Levesque, like he was a leader. Like
No
these guys
question,
were-
no question.
these
And you
guys
knew
were
where
not
he
like-
stood. By the way, there's another premier that's awfully forgotten when he played a really key role in this whole business of individual rights and freedoms, and that was the Manitoba Sterling Lyon. He
Right.
was a lion.
Yeah,
Not
from
only,
Manitoba.
by name, but by character. And he was perhaps of all of us, he was perhaps the one who was most steadfast on individual rights and freedoms and what we have today.
Well,
That fantastic guy, and really understood the law, understood the Constitution. Once again, from a smaller province, but a very accomplished man and very deeply rooted in what Constitution meant versus what a piece of legislation meant. He understood the nation versus the province. He understood the nation versus the federal government.
well, listen, we could go on at length, and maybe we could do that on another show, Brian. Lee, thank you very much for being with us tonight. And
I want to thank you both. I want to thank you both just for standing up for Canada. I see a lot of people in the chat here sending their hats off to both of you for being such arbiters of truth. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Randy has done a fantastic service by articulating and posing all the questions and comments that he posed in this thing tonight, because that forces me, as the last signatory to the Constitution, to try to articulate what it was we were talking about, and makes therefore the thing far more understandable. If you had somebody who was just asking easy questions, the people would not get near as much out of it.
Well, listen, thank you very much. I've got to get on to the Twitter space. So, Brian, if you ever get Twitter, let me know. Or I guess it's called X now. And we'll get you on a Twitter space as well. But thank you much. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. Thank you, Lee. And until next week, have fun and enjoy yourselves. Bye.
See you next week.
Aye.